Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of The Fourth Estate. It's a special edition because for the first time it coincides with the celebration of the World Press Freedom Day. Journalists across the world join together hands today to celebrate under the theme Journalism in the Face of Fear and Favor. This week on this week's edition we'll talk to Catherine Aniti and Rachel Mugarura on media viability. We also talk to them about the threat that the state poses to the media. We also talk to Chamtetera Muhereza, who has been analyzing the Ugandan media and how spending from advertising has been dropping and how that affects the revenues of the media. The Global Press Freedom Index measures press freedom all across the world. It ranked this year that nearly 75% of all countries were in conditions that would be described as difficult and hard for journalists to work in. Much of this freedom of the press is eroded mostly by censorship regimes, intimidation and low wages for journalists. This week we started by talking to Rachel Mugarura and Catherine Aniti on the threats to press freedom in Uganda. For Uganda, the Press Freedom Index, which measures the freedom of the press across the globe, couldn't have come at a worse time. A country that had been struggling dropped a further 8 places to 125th. The Reporters Without Borders Index pointed more specifically to the acts of intimidation from the state and violence against reporters as the key drivers for the declining press freedom. But for the press to survive, it must, at very first, be viable. We talked to Rachel Mugarura, who works at the African Center for Media Excellence and a former editor. And we also talked to Catherine Aniti, a lawyer, on the challenges of the Ugandan press. What do you guys think are the pressing demands right now that are affecting press freedom in Uganda particularly?
Okay, it is very hard to rate the most pressing demands facing journalists today. But I think what is foremost in our minds are two things: the viability and sustainability of the media at this time. Will we be able to continue? Will journalists have jobs and so on? And the second thing, which is on everybody's lips, is how journalists can resist, how journalists can stand against the infodemic, infodemic that we are facing, and prove themselves as credible sources of news and information. And I think those are the two major threats that I see that are facing journalists and the freedom of the press at this time.
All right, Catherine.
Yes. So one of the biggest threats that I've seen right now is censorship from governments. So journalists are seen as a threat rather than as an addition to the viability of government. So for example, we are seeing a proliferation of laws that are coming in place and not in promotion of good journalism. And then the other thing that I see that is that the laws that are in place, for example, the Press and Media Journalists Act does not promote really journalism. And that's why it's easy for bodies like Uganda Communications Commission to usurp powers of the Media Council and start regulating journalists, and yet their role is to regulate broadcast. So as if you recall last year, we had the UCC coming out to say, to order media houses to fire journalists. So the question would be, is that their mandate? What is the Media Council doing about this? And then how strong is the media itself? We didn't see an uproar of the media coming together to detest this regulatory overreach. So in my view, if the media comes together with government so we can have progressive laws, that's the first step to having a progressive media. And I agree with Rachel that the viability of media is at stake. If you have been reading recently, we are seeing lots of newspapers closing shop in different countries in Africa, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. And most journalists in Uganda, correspondents, we know they earn very little pay. So the question would be, what happens to them? The correspondents are definitely going to lose their jobs. I see that some media houses are asking some journalists to take unpaid leave. And there's a threat to that in a way that we may see corruption cases rising amongst journalists because they need to survive. So if, for example, a journalist is beaten right now and paid 1 million shillings, would they sue? No, because they need to survive. So those are some of the threats that we're seeing to media freedom in Uganda and across the region. The viability of the media in terms of the business models. So we need to see a shift and innovation for sustainability.
I wanted to continue the conversation on the viability. And Rachel, you mentioned it first. In the lockdown, what happened to print media is totally unforgivable, nearly. Many of the circulation points for print media have now died out. So print media has had to go digital, and there's no advertising there. But even then, majority of the advertisers are telling the media now that they don't have advertising budgets. Actually, advertising budgets are considered as luxury budgets. So the media has had very little money to work with. And yet there aren't many models that would sustain journalism outside of public trust and advertising revenue. What would you say is the bullet point for media viability? What should media focus on to be viable as a business?
It's hard to come up with one clear answer in regards to that. We've looked to media viability options outside of Africa, but the media markets are so vastly different and the economies are so different to ours. So for instance, we've been told to push print media, TVs and radio should push to digitization. But we know that internet access, access to facilities such as these are still limited. Even I, who has access to the internet and this platform, you can still see that access isn't entirely 100%. So what is it for the rest of the population out there? I don't think that there is one easy answer, unfortunately. I think that each media market will have to figure it out. And within each media market, each media house shall have to decide what it is, what product they are able to produce that is sellable for the long term, that is attractive to both advertisers and audiences. It's a very hard thing to answer. It's a very hard question to answer. But I think that the advantage of a time like this is it is pushing media owners and managers and those within this media ecosystem to start thinking about their own media markets, the demands of the media markets, the vagaries of the economy, and to decide what it is they want. I'll give you one really quick example. You pointed out print media, but as soon as you asked that question, the thing that came to my mind was online media. We have a plethora of online news organizations that have started, but it is very hard to distinguish one from the other. Indeed, many of them are merely replicating what is in the newspapers, what is on TV, on radio, and delivering it to us. Perhaps this is the time for online media that is quick to establish and so on, to start thinking about niche markets and information that is relevant specifically to the kind of people who are online every day and need a specific sort of information. So Raymond, I don't think there is an easy answer, but what a good time. If anything will come out of it, there will come out of it some sort of thinking, some sort of cohesive plan towards sustainability of the media in Uganda.
Catherine, together with answering the question on media viability, I also want you to, you talked about the Uganda Communications Commission. One of the things that the media does, particularly broadcast media, is pay license fees to them. What can happen during this period for a communications commission that regulates the media to ease the pressure and burden on the media?
So right now, most sectors across the world are seeing the economic burden on the different industries. So it would be would call upon the Uganda Communications Commission not to put pressure on media houses to pay broadcast to pay license fees which are high. But then I would like to pick up from where Rachel stopped. The question right now is, should we let the newspaper die? So it's been a debate that's ongoing, and how many people do read newspapers should be the first thing that we ask ourselves. What is are there people buying newspapers as they used to, or are they shifting to online versions of news? And I agree with her that when you read most of the online versions, they're replicating what's offline. Uh, However, when we look at the regulatory framework for online news, it's insufficient. So when the Press and Journalists Act regulates mainly print media, and then we have UCC regulating broadcast media, but then it's not so clear on how to regulate social media platforms, which are right now the biggest source of news. So how do we save journalism? I also agree with her that we need to innovate, but in an economy where everyone is struggling, is the government going to prioritize media? It has never prioritized media. We've seen it in most cases coming to stifle it. So when we think of innovation and seeking for financial support and bailouts from government to support the media, is it a priority? Recently, we saw that NAB asked for 10 billion shillings to support media during COVID. So the question would be, how would that money be distributed across all media houses equitably? There's no supporting framework for that. So even as we ask for bailouts and financial support from the government, I think there should be a clear cut strategy of distributing those funds and ensuring that even the smallest media house up country will benefit and survive. So we need to push, as the media, we need to push for a framework that's ask government to support. It's been done in other jurisdictions, but we should do it in an organized way. So let's assume that Parliament passed the 10 billion for media. If I could ask you, how would that money be distributed? Maybe the big media houses like NTV and NBS would benefit from it. How about the small broadcast media in Gulu or Arua? How will they benefit from that money?
Thank you. I want us now to spend the last minutes talking about the elephant in the room, which is the state. Over the last months, the amount of pressure on the media from the state has been high. We're talking about arrests, we're talking about sanctions from UCC, we're talking about journalists who've been taken to court for defamation, and even some who are threatened with being tried for libel, a case which no longer exists on the books of Uganda. In terms of that being a consistent threat to the media, how must the media deal with it? Starting with you, Rachel.
The first thing is that the media must make sure journalists are above reproach. It's one thing to say, stop harassing us when we have dirt on our backs. So let's do a little cleaning in-house. Are we above petty politics? Is brown envelope journalism still going on? Do we really serve the public interest? Are we seeking the truth and reporting on it? The basic things that are central to our profession. I think once we are sure about what is happening in-house, or at least once we have controls to regulate ourselves and to ensure the highest standard of professionalism, then we can make a consolidated push and ask government for increased freedoms. Now, that is not to say that we should wait until we are entirely spick and span before government recognizes that a free press is essential to the democracy of the nation. I'm not saying that, but we should take care that we are also dealing with our in-house problems before we go forward. It cannot be overstressed, the need for us to continue to look within our laws to understand how policy is developed and why certain policies are passed that create restrictions against the media. Very often we are at the tail end of this debate. A law has been passed or a government agency is in place that are oppressing or suppressing free media. I think it's time for us to join the debate before legislation is passed and to be a part of the policy formation process so that our voices as journalists can be heard throughout it. That is what I have to say about that.
Catherine, how must the media deal with the persistent threat that is the state?
Okay, so is the media organized enough to have a strong voice to defend itself against government excesses? And I think it's not. When you look at Kenya, the media there is very strong because it has come together. There's the Media Council of Kenya, and then their subsidiaries. We have the Editors Guild, which speaks out for its journalists. But when you look at Uganda, I know that there's an effort to establish the Editors Guild. It's a very welcome effort, and I think that will bring some strength to media's voice in the country. But we have this thing of the elitist media and then those other media people. So before you resolve the hierarchies in the media, I don't think it is possible for the media in Uganda to come up with a strong voice that can fight against its excesses against it from the government. I don't think it's going to be possible again if the media has that division of, you know, we are this this voice that is going to defend the poor, and then we have those that are viewed as elitists. I work a lot with media, and when you hear the diverse views of the Raymonds and then the small journalists in Gulu, they're like, you know, for us, we are left here to wallow in our poor journalism, and then most of us are correspondents. So if the media doesn't feel, if journalists don't feel like they matter and that there are hierarchies of the mighty and the lone, then I don't think there will be one strong media. So let's juxtapose that with the law society. If a lawyer is beaten, you'll see all lawyers coming out to speak against those violations against a lawyer. But when it comes to the media, we don't see that strong voice. So the first thing is for the media to organize so that the government can listen to you when you speak out. But I see the government enjoying this ping pong because they know that the media is disorganized, and then once in a while they'll call you and give a few of you some money, and then that again will destabilize the movement to bring the media together. So the first thing is to mobilize and have a strong voice. We need to see an editors guild that is all-encompassing around the country. Its voice is respected by all journalists around the country. We need to see the media council working for the journalists and not just coming out to condemn journalists. We need to see a broadcaster like UCC also coming up with programs to promote the development of media. But without this one strong voice, the media will still stay disoriented, and then the government will find it easy to attack you.
Parting remarks, guys. And this is really because there's so many young journalists who watch this program and they look forward to, say, advice from people like you. But parting remarks, I want you to just tell me, how do you define press freedom and what should journalists do to guarantee press freedom in the country?
Oh, Catherine, do you want to go first?
I'll let you go first, and then I'll go after.
My English teacher always told me, don't define a term with a term. So I don't know how else to define press freedom apart from the freedom of the press. And in that, it's just to think about scenarios in which journalists and other media practitioners are able to operate responsibly, freely, and in a manner that not just builds their own industry, but builds the country as a whole, with regulatory support and with the support of the public. That's how I would define media freedom. Somebody once said, I think it was James Tumusime, the former managing editor of The Observer, who said the media must be embraced with all its imperfections, because not doing so would be like disregarding democracy, because sometimes it produces bad leaders, and these leaders develop bad laws. We can't do away with democracy, so we can't do away with media. So we know it's imperfect, like Catherine has said, very divided, very disaggregated according to the size of media houses and the wealth of journalists. But that notwithstanding, there are journalists throughout this country, from Moroto to Kabale, Kisoro, from Kalangala all the way to Arua, who are doing small things within their own means to ensure that the media, the independence of the media remains. There are disparate voices, yes, but there are people, pockets of people all over. So I would encourage our younger journalists to look for points within their communities, to look for persons, media organizations, lawyers like Catherine, who are doing this work.
So press freedom is the cornerstone of society. If we don't have journalists doing investigative stories and reporting to the people, then we cannot say that we are living in a democratic society. So it's very important that governments across the world, including the Ugandan government, provides conducive environments for journalists and other media workers to do their work uninhibited, without the unnecessary restrictions. We want to see laws that favor the development of journalism and media rather than stifling it. We want to see media coming up with strong bodies like the Editors Guild and Media Council. Maybe we can advocate, if the media was strong, we probably advocate for a co-regulatory kind of system where the media kind of regulates itself, but under law, under statutory law. So that is what we need to look at. However, in an era where we see journalists not respecting basic ethics of reporting, then the governments are not going to grant you that press freedom that you desire. But we applaud the good work that journalists are doing and other media workers in giving us information, especially right now. I think the COVID story is the biggest story of our times. And access to information is very important, and the media is doing a great job. We would love to see them ask more questions, probe more. What quality of information are you giving to the people? We see in Zimbabwe that journalists went to court and successfully had courts issue orders to the Minister of Information, to the Minister of Health, as to the quality of information that they give to the people regarding the management of COVID. So we want to see a media here that is going to challenge some of these restrictions successfully. The lawyers are ready to represent you, but we need to see the will coming from you. So press freedom is a two-way. We need to see ethical journalists, we need to see professional journalists, and then the government will definitely listen to you. If you're more organized, you have a stronger voice to lobby for the advancement of press freedoms in this country.
In both print, radio, and TV journalism, cutthroat competitions have been very tight in the year. But what's also been very tight is the number of advertisers who are advertising with traditional media. The spend has gone down and gone down drastically. That means that media houses are no longer able to afford their own staff, but also to be able to afford their costs of operations. This has had a very drastic impact on how much the media can tell in terms of stories and how well the media can tell its own stories. For journalism to be a viable business, Advertisers pour their money at the heart of their audiences. It's a carefully marked trade-off that must protect the independence of the newsroom, but yet deliver numbers for advertisers. A wave of revolution has swept over news consumption, democratizing both news access and news delivery. Online media has taken the greatest part of the pie. In the last 2 years, advertising spend to traditional media has gone down by 31%, but risen a mere 16% to online media, a report from Geopol states. One man at the heart of this spend is Muhereza Chamtetera, a former journalist turned advertiser. We speak to him. There's been a big contest over advertising spend in traditional media going down. Is it factually correct that the advertising spend for traditional media is going down, and how much, to what extent is it?
Okay, I think I mean, and I'm going to speak, I have had a chance of being a journalist, but also being involved in advertising because I run an advertising agency. Now, of course, for us, in advertising, we follow the numbers because there is a measure we call the cost per 1,000. What does it cost my client to reach 1,000 people? And that is always a function of how many people are watching, or how many, actually they call them the eyeballs. How many eyeballs am I able to reach for my client? Now, the truth is that, of course, people have never stopped consuming information. People are consuming news. What is changing is how are they consuming it. Now, of course, given the flexibility around new media, a story breaks, and I give you an example of when recently there was a new commissioner general appointed at URA and the Bank of Uganda governor. In 20 minutes, my website had a story up, and I already had the profile of who the governor was, his picture, and everything. Now, I saw one of the local dailies also had the story the next day, like 24 hours later, no, about 18 hours later. I don't know why they are going to run that had not been run. So the whole perspective, I think people are consuming news more in the in the new media space, and then of course, as you know, day follows night, or night follows day for that matter. Then for us advertisers, we have to follow where the people are going, and that's where we take our money. Now, if you look at, for example, the Ipsos report on advertising spend, you realize that advertising spend, and of course Ipsos does track, they track the traditional spend, that is radio, they track TV and newspapers. Now, if you look at the generally as traditional advertising, it has been growing at an average of about 4.7% a year since 2011 up to 2017. And when it reached 2017, it stopped growing, and in 2018 it reduced by 10%. And in 2019, it reduced by another 21%. That means that in terms of the money that people are spending on traditional media has reduced. But also another interesting trend that you will see when you read these reports is that the way how people allocate media budgets has also changed. Now, in 2011, 60% of an average advertising budget of a media house of say a brand like MTN, for example, on average would be 60% would be put on radio, 16% would go on TV, and 24% in newspapers. But if you look in 29, that has changed. Now it's 56% on radio from 60%. The TV has grown from 16% to 34%, and newspapers have reduced from 24% to 10%. Now, I've also been trying to follow up media houses in terms of turnover, especially looking at the three major media groups. That's, of course, Monitor Publications, or maybe National Media Group Uganda, where you have Monitor and NTV. You have Vision Group and Next Media Services, who are the biggest, of course, media groups that you have in Uganda. And if you look at around 2018, their combined turnover was about 150 billion. And it's been growing at an average of 5%, a year. So still, you see, this money is not so much money. 150 billion shillings is not so much money. But if you also look at how much it has been growing, their revenue has been growing at about 5%. Now, if you consider that our inflation is almost around that, it means actually there's not been significant growth happening. So media houses are under pressure. Of course, journalists are also under pressure. They want to be paid more money. But then if you are an owner of a media house, where your revenue is growing at 5%, and I imagine all the costs are growing. Newsprint, of course, as trees become more scarce, newsprint is becoming more expensive. Equipment is becoming more expensive. The shilling, of course, has its issues. So basically, the media owners are under challenge now. I believe these are some of the things that they do not share with their journalists, and of course, for obvious reasons. So I think this is a conversation that needs to be had, so people understand that business is not growing. So what do we do? So that's how I look at it in terms of the perspective. Yeah.
The media competition in this period has actually gone up. When you even talk about print competition, it's really gone up. It's now in the mix of the next. TV competition has neared hostile levels now for the major TV in the country. Radio competition nearly as much. How much is this competition feeding into the grand scheme of things of who gets more money at the end of the day and how much they pay their journalists?
Okay, I think for the start, I must say, Ugandan media landscape is unique in the region. We, as of end of 2019, we had about 300 radio stations. We had about 39 free-to-air TVs and about 4 print dairies. If you compare us with Kenya, which economy is, I think, more than like twice our size, Kenya has only, I think they had about 173 radio stations, had about, I think, 8 or 9 newspapers, and I think their TVs are just so around as much. So we have very many media houses here that are competing for a small, I mean, we're in a small economy. To give you an example, I was looking at the other figures. In 2019, the Standard Media Group, their turnover was about 4.1 Kenyan billion, 4.1 billion Kenyan shillings, which is equivalent to about 144 billion in Uganda shillings. So basically, that what Standard Media Group earned is equivalent to the turnover of Vision Group, National Media Group Uganda, and Next Media Services combined. Now, that gives you where the competition is starting from. So we have so many people who are competing for bread that is getting smaller and smaller. So then it's no surprise that if you look at like 5 years ago, actually a number of media houses are closing one by one. Of course, we first had the move to digital, which knocked off a couple of radio stations and TVs who couldn't afford the the license fees and all that. But with time, as things get harder, because even for the main media groups, even themselves, if you look at their finances, they're also not, they are all hard pressed. And no wonder when this COVID thing did come up, we've seen some of the guys whom we thought are the biggest, they were the first to move to cut salaries. So I think the competition is there. They are trying to outcompete themselves for something that is small. And then guess what? Now, as these guys try to outcompete themselves, you have a bigger animal, the internet, new media, you have social media, which is actually which is taking away the money. So I think it's more of it's basically a fight that is not sustainable. And I've said before that in the next 10 years, Uganda is not going to have any profitable newspaper that will be running. And those who will be there, they'll probably be subsidized by the state. But yes, things are getting tough.
Cham, you've been a journalist in at least 2 of the biggest media houses in Uganda. So I want you to also wear the journalist's hat here. Journalism is very much about interest good. It's not something that you can package as a product. How must journalists turn around and now start to make profit for their own entities, and those entities start to pay them better?
I think journalism is a public good, and I'm always having this honest conversation with my readers, and we need to prepare our readers to be comfortable with the fact that whereas you're happy with me delivering some certain like amount of content, you either need to be willing to pay for it, or if you're not willing to pay for it, let somebody who's willing to pay for it have some bit of leeway without compromise. Of course, I believe to me, these things are not mutually exclusive. You can still have an objective and truthful story that meets the objectives of the advertiser who subsidizes the media house to make sure that it is able to keep running. Because see, for example, I'll give an example to say, for me to write a story to say, MTN has launched product X, and product X is supposed to do Y and Z for the market, and I mean, and I leave it as plain as that. And if MTN is willing to pay for it, I'm not told any lie. I have just simply put what MTN wants, and actually what is also the truth, and in a way also the market wants to know what is available out there in the market. Now, if this person is willing to pay me X amount of money, so then I can be able to facilitate my reporters to go and do investigative stories so as to serve the public good. I believe that, that's the middle space that journalism needs to, because what journalism has done is that journalism has evolved from the time where it was financed by the state, from the days of Radio Uganda and UBC TV, where the state was, where the taxpayer was paying, to now it's becoming a commercial entity. So now the owners of the media houses need to make a certain amount of money to buy the latest equipment. If you need to run, I mean, and I don't know how much it costs to run a 1 hour live, broadcast, say from like Karamoja. But you see, for somebody to be able to do that, they need to have some money, and who's going to bring the money? Because as if you look at the figures, for example, for Vision Group last year, which are published figures, 62% of their revenue does come from advertising. So that means actually it's advertising that runs, now. And as a media owner, you need to think about, yes, readers are your very important stakeholders, but also advertisers are. So how do you balance that thing between readers and advertisers? And I think that's a discussion that the journalism schools, we as journalists need to be discussing of how do I balance the interests of all my stakeholders and keep and still keep the profession intact. And I think that is something that can be done.
Thank you so much, Muhereza Chamtetera, for speaking to us. Muhereza Chamtetera is the managing director for the CEO magazine in Uganda. He was analyzing the viability of the media and how advertising spend is affecting that. Now, this week, Uganda dropped almost 125th in position on the press freedom ranking. That puts Uganda in a very delicate place for journalists to work in. We asked journalists in Uganda what press freedom means to them, and we leave you with their drops for this week.
I'm Andrew Chamagere, omuntu wa wansi. To me, press freedom means to foster the infrastructure of democracy.
Eddembe ly'abannamawulire mbufunze nandikitutte nga ffe okulera eddembe ly'abantu ba wansi oba bannayuganda bonna okubeera nga bamanya ebifa mu ggwanga lyabwe. Nabwe kitaawo tuba tuteekeddwa okuweebwa ekyanya okubeera nga tubanoonyeza amawulire gano watali kukoona ku nsoloboto ne gabatuukako nga bwe bageetaaga, kubanga eryo ddembe lyabwe mu ssemateeka nga bannayuganda, ate ffe buvunaanyizibwa bwaffe kye nanditutte nga eddembe ly'abannamawulire oba press freedom.
Look, press freedom for me as an individual is a right of any journalist to report objectively. Information is very important to society, and if people have chosen to be professional in the field of journalism, they owe that obligation to society to report the news to them as objectively as possible. So whatever stops that from happening is a deterrent to the press freedom. Press freedom is to be able to overcome all those obstacles that could stifle the free flow of objective reporting.